Let's get started. It's noon here. So welcome to Iowa Ideas in Depth Week. This week's focus is on homelessness, and today's session is policymaking to protect housing as a human right. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Marissa Payne, and I'm a local government reporter with the Gazette, and I'll be the moderator for today's session, which is our final of In Depth Week. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our Iowa Ideas presenting sponsor, ITC Midwest, and thank you to our panelists for joining us here today, where we'll discuss some of the barriers to enacting policies that promote affordable housing and could help end homelessness and what Iowans can do about them. So I'll let our panelists introduce themselves first. Before we begin, I'll just start with Jack.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the Gazette for sponsoring this, and your whole week has been spectacular. It's advanced the idea of homelessness as a policy issue, and I'm glad that I've been invited to join. I'm the principal of Hatch Kiernan Galloway Development, and we have been in business for 20-something years, and our specialty is low-income housing development. I'm also a former state senator and spent 22 years in the legislature and was chair of committees relating to education and human resources, housing, and healthcare. So I've really married the two political careers and the business career to focus in on housing for low-income Iowans. And we've been involved in 4 projects, the Bridge Home in Ames, the Clinton YWCA, Central Iowa Shelter and Services, and a new one in Des Moines starts right here, working with homeless youth and educational programs. We have done the bulk of our work on low-income housing, and I'm sure we'll have a discussion about low-income versus moderate housing. Again, I appreciate being invited to sit in on the panel.
Yeah, thank you. Elizabeth?
Thank you. And I will echo Jack's thanks to the Gazette and to the Iowa Ideas team. You guys have been phenomenal. I've really enjoyed listening to all of the various discussions through the week. I'm Elizabeth Kurtz, Executive Director of Charlotte Family Housing in Charlotte, North Carolina. We are an economic mobility program built around the needs of working families experiencing homelessness. Our moms are the people that you meet every day at your child's school, at the library, the call center, at the bank, checking you in at the doctor's office. They're working hard, but the cost of living here in Charlotte, and which is actually quite similar to the cost of living, believe it or not, in Iowa, it just makes it hard to keep up. So our program is about helping our families increase their income, ensure that they have access to all of the resources that they need to maintain stable housing moving forward. Things like stable childcare, career path jobs, quality health care, financial literacy skills, and healthy and positive support networks.
Yeah, and for context, for those of you who are curious why we have a guest from out of state, I've heard from people in housing world that Charlotte has something going for it and is doing something well with housing. So I figured, we could invite a guest from that area to figure out what they're doing well and what we can learn from them here in Iowa. So thank you for joining us, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Ashley.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to participate in this panel and really excited to hear what discussion we have today. My name is Ashley Balius, and I'm the Director of Community Outreach and Assistance here with Linn County Community Services. Just to give you a little idea about what that means, what my title means is I spend a little bit of my time overseeing the General Assistance Department here at Linn County, where we provide rent and utility assistance to low-income Linn County residents. And we are very connected to homelessness, especially more now than I think we've ever been, where we have a lot of folks that are experiencing, of course, financial hardship, and they either are currently experiencing homelessness and trying to get into housing, or they are feeling very much the threat of homelessness when they're coming through our doors. The other aspect of my job is community outreach. And what that really means, or the sort of call to action I've been given from Linn County, is that I'm intended to be going out in community, having community conversations and getting a better understanding of what those key issues are. And then through that, really then start to identify how do we move forward as a community to start to resolve those issues, bring folks together. And I'm really excited about the work that we are currently doing with the Alliance for Equitable Housing. Of course, as everyone would identify, housing and homelessness are two of the biggest issues that we are faced right now as a community and trying to figure out how to solve them. And so I'm excited to be able to talk to you all a little bit more about the Alliance for Equitable Housing as we work through this panel. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Jessica.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jessica Andino. I use she, her pronouns and then ella in Spanish. Thank you to the Gazette and the Iowa Ideas team again, echoing what everyone else has said. This has been a rockstar week, and then I feel very honored to just even be invited to participate in today's panel. As I said, I'm Jessica Andino, the Executive Director at the Johnson County Affordable Housing Coalition. We work on education, advocacy, and then also partnerships for supporting affordable housing initiatives here in Johnson County. Located in Iowa City, Iowa, which has the highest cost of living throughout the state. We are a board-driven nonprofit organization that has a lot of key partners in play that deal with homelessness issues and the clients that we serve. Additionally, I am a PhD candidate over at the University of Iowa College of Public Health, and my focus is actually on housing as a social determinant of health, looking specifically at low-income housing and forms of affordable housing like manufactured homes. So I'm very honored to be here amongst all these other panelists, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, thank you all. Well, that's actually a good segue into our first question, which is, what do we know about housing as a social determinant of health, and why is it so important to have quality housing to provide a stable base for people in other aspects of their life? And we can start with Jessica.
I'm going to assume that's my cue, right? So first, I always like to talk about, I wear a public health hat, but not everybody does. So a social determinant of health are just the conditions in the environment where people are born, live, work, play, worship, age, that affect a wide variety of health impacts, our functioning, and just our overall quality of life, risks, and outcomes. Specifically related to housing, if we all think about where we spend our day, if we're not at the office, a lot of times we're at home, right? We're within our neighborhoods. And so that really does, as Marissa was saying, provide a strong base of either good health outcomes or poor health outcomes based on where we're living and growing and hopefully thriving. I always like to put a plug that housing is extremely essential, and it is a basis as a social determinant of health, and that's why I'm a strong proponent of the housing first model of getting people into homes and then dealing with other complex issues that they may have. But as probably none of you are actually surprised by, there's a really complex association between housing and health. I'll be putting into the chat later some, systematic reviews and, wearing that PhD hat of articles that y'all can review later. But key takeaways is that as housing is associated with health, it's not just physical health, it's also your mental health. And then poor housing quality, both in built or even how you perceive your housing and your satisfaction of the housing type that you have, can actually increase or decrease the type of diseases that may affect you throughout the aging process. So I think it's a really interesting topic, and I know a lot of these individuals that do direct service can talk more about that as well.
I was wondering if you could also provide information on the just the study that was done in Johnson County, showing the impact of the shelter house, when we offer supportive services to people versus just letting people stay on the street. What sort of cost savings can we see from that?
Yeah, so what I think you're referring to is the Fuse study that happened through our local homeless coordinating board, right? Trying to pull that up here. So it ended up saving in Johnson County a large amount of money by actually helping these individuals that were chronically homeless, right, in Johnson County, being able to save unreimbursed costs. So as I'm looking at the numbers here, because I just pulled it up, the implementation of this Fuse Housing First concept actually saves 60% of the costs, rather than our current approach of just letting community users that are chronically homeless utilize services in our area. And that could be through the jail system and policing systems that we have through justice. It could be through healthcare systems that we have, that we know that individuals facing chronic homelessness would be more likely to use the ED or the emergency department rather than preventative care. So if I look at this correctly, it would actually, over a 5-year span, cost an approximately $2.7 million more to the overall cost burden community than if we actually implemented a housing first opportunity here in Johnson County specifically. These numbers also were from 2010 to 2014. As we know, things have gone up in price, whether we like it or not, including housing and healthcare and other costs. So I will make sure to put that in the chat as well. I'll be quoting directly from Shelter House, which is one of our community partners that we work with.
Marissa, since this is a policy panel, let me start at a very high level to show how important it is to bring our politician and elected officials at every level into this conversation. In 1986, Ronald Reagan and the Democratic Congress radically changed the method of financing housing from government-owned to privately owned. And privately owned, they used it by allowing tax credits to be given to corporations if they invested and provided equity for housing development. And that's the project, and that's how our company participates. And we are the developers, and we have an ample supply of investors through this project or program that allows us to build houses almost anywhere in the country, not just big cities or towns, but in rural areas, rural and small towns, and providing a variety of new ideas. And that's why the importance of this panel is so important, and the advocacy of housing and supportive services. Most developers in this Section 42 low-income housing tax credit project are developers that provide housing for citizens that are 60, maybe an 80% median income. It doesn't get to the very low income or the homeless unless a developer and a state create programs in which specifically target homelessness. And the social determinant is beginning to filter into this because we're working with a program. We've worked with 2 programs and 2 projects that we have already built, one in Des Moines and one in Cedar Rapids, where we have partnered with foster care providers. One is YSS in Des Moines, and the other one is Foundation 2 in Cedar Rapids, where we have reserved 10% and higher of our apartments to the foster care kids, so that these 2 organizations, YSS and Foundation 2, can bring children in off the streets, give them a satisfied and stable home environment. We have offices in our buildings for these 2 nonprofits, so they are available to them all the time. And our staff works with the Foundation 2 and YSS staff to make sure that these kids are learning how to live independently. And even further than that, social determinants is so important that we have a project in Des Moines with a nonprofit that provides educational services to youth that are in gangs, getting them off the streets. But if they get off the streets into the school and then back out to the street again, you've not solved the problem. And in Des Moines, this agency had two kids, 2 students shot and killed at their academy. And now we're trying, and we think we'll be very successful in financing a place where we will actually have studio apartments at the new academy, so kids aren't returned back to the environment where where it's so strenuous on them that they can't help but fail. So we're going to keep them in a facility where they have 24-hour not only protection but services available to them. They could certainly go in and out as they do and as they please, but the idea of having housing being the focal point and for the balance of bringing other services into them is so important.
Yeah, and we do have an audience, I don't know, comment here that housing first is great if services can get in quick enough. Too often we see that the person gets evicted before those services are ever able to be put into place. Perhaps Ashley, if you could weigh in on that, I know you've worked a lot with eviction prevention, some of those like federal funding streams.
Sure. So I think there's a couple of ways I'd want to address some of this question, especially again, as we think of policy questions. I think, the supportive services side of Housing First and supportive housing and all of the different models is so critical. But I think what we often find is that, I'm going to say funding more broadly, right? You can look at it more individually if you'd like, but funding more broadly oftentimes does not like to pay for staff. And staff and people are what actually make these things happen. It's what makes them successful. And so I think that's when we think about different policy opportunities or advocacy opportunities, I feel like looking at different funders, whether they're government or local philanthropic opportunities, I think really understanding and making sure that that we are being willing to pay for staff is so critically important, and make sure that we're paying also an appropriate amount for those staff, not even just like, I think what we typically would assume a nonprofit should accept. It's just such a critically important thing. And I think it's something that we are continuing as we work through the Alliance for Equitable Housing, especially. It's a conversation that we're constantly having about what do staffing models need to look like? What do they need to be? Especially as we start to try to figure out how we resolve these issues. One thing that we encountered through the Alliance for Equitable Housing as we started embarking on this endeavor was that staff capacity and fatigue was so critically high, especially when we're talking about these organizations that are charged with working with these populations that are so high need, so high barrier. It's just such an important topic, I think, as we embark on trying to figure out how we solve these problems. Like, we have to make sure that we're supporting the people that do the work and make sure that we're willing to pay enough to actually do the work. That's something that I think is really, it's just such a challenge that we hear when we work with our nonprofits. And I think I might have went astray a little bit in answering that question, Marissa. So if there's another part of that question I was supposed to answer, please bring it back around to me. But to me, that that was what I thought of immediately as we started having this conversation.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, do you have anything to add to that from the nonprofit capacity standpoint? What are we seeing in North Carolina?
There we go. Sorry about that. One of the things that we're seeing in North Carolina, going back a little bit to what Jessica was talking about, is one of our local healthcare systems has actually become an affordable housing investor, recognizing that not only their frequent users, but also their staff are highly cost burdened. So they are providing housing opportunities for their frequent users and their staff here in Charlotte, and embedding nursing services and healthcare services within that multifamily property as a support.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say, I really love that idea. I was just recently in a conversation with some of our area nonprofits where they were talking about the fact that their staff are often competing with the populations we're trying to serve for the same housing units in order to make them affordable. And so again, there's just so many challenges. Like, you can pick this apart in so many different ways, but it is such an important piece of this. I love that idea that North Carolina has implemented.
Yeah, I know we talked about this briefly, just kind of the nuances between, we have affordable housing, low-income housing, workforce housing. How can we be, as we're looking to address affordable housing issues, how can we be mindful of the nuances of, these different types of housing and policy making? And do you think kind of what's lost in the nuances there by kind of lumping this all as part of the same discussion?
Absolutely. I'll lead off with this one, because I think it's really important to view this as separate things. We talk about affordable housing, but often what we really mean is housing affordability. Housing affordability is how much any one household can truly afford to spend, not just to make it work, but to really be able to afford that housing. The federal standard and pretty much the practical standard is that housing should take up no more than 30% of a household's gross income. All housing ultimately is affordable to somebody or it wouldn't get built. So for low-income households, the amount of rent that they can afford doesn't cover the cost to operate a building, to cover the mortgage, the repairs, capital expense, vacancy, et cetera. And this is where the concept of affordable housing comes in. Affordable housing is really purpose-built to be affordable to those who aren't adequately served by the market. And I'll let Jack weigh in on some of the particulars of that, but I think that is one of those subtle nuances that I really think we need to keep in mind, especially as lay people.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, because politicians don't know the difference between those 4 or 5 divisions. To a city council person in any of our cities, they think affordable is really a middle income family not being able to afford a house because interest rates are too high. And so it takes a really yeoman's effort by the advocates to really separate this to be something like, the homeless is a division, very low income, which is the projects that I get involved with, the low income housing tax credits, to affordable, which may mean for middle housing, which politicians are famous at looking at and trying to describe. So we really have to make clear that what we're talking about are people who probably have jobs, even homeless individuals, part-time jobs, minimum wage jobs, but they're not able to have a stable income enough to have a home. That's as important and as necessary for a city or a town or a state even to develop economically to make sure that these families are housed. But we have to divide them up and we have to be very specific to our city council people and to our legislators. Otherwise, they're going to get confused and they'll be thinking something else other than what we're talking about with this topic of homelessness.
I'm gonna go one off of that too, Jack, that like stating these AMIs often isn't enough. It's like we actually have to talk about what jobs are fitting into these limitations, right? So I alluded to earlier that Johnson County is extremely expensive, highest cost burden in the state. And so if you're looking at like a family of 4, okay, so maybe you have 2 individuals that are working, maybe as, like paraprofessionals at a school, which we'd all deem as an essential job, they're probably still considered very low income. They're maybe making 60% AMI, extremely low or very low to low income. They're making up to $70,000 here in Johnson County. We at the Affordable Housing Coalition will serve anybody that is low income, under 80% AMI, and a family of 4, that's still a household income of $92,000 a year. So these aren't people that are, directly minimum wage workers that can also be helped with state, federal, or other funding, but they're your, single parent that's working as a receptionist at that office, that health office that we were talking to before. It could be up to, I think it's $34,000 a year. Is still extremely low income in Johnson County. So kind of putting faces or at least professions to these arguments that we're making to policymakers really can hit it home.
I think something that's worthwhile to bring up in this discussion too is, I think what I would call some of like the system failures that we see as well. So like for households, for instance, who are disabled and they rely heavily on SSI in order to survive, right? They're saying that they're disabled. The Social Security Administration has confirmed that they are in fact disabled and have no ability to work. And yet they're earning something like $950 a month. I can't remember exactly what the amount is, but certainly in Johnson County, that doesn't work, right? Here in Lynn County, depending on where you look, the average income is about the average rent is about $850, which does not leave enough left over, even if you're getting SNAP benefits, even if you're making use of all of the other resources available to you. Right. So I think that's like another really big piece of this where we see some systemic failures. And I think in order to develop housing that is low enough cost for that household to be under that like 30% affordability range, it doesn't pencil out, right? You need really heavy subsidy, and not even just that upfront subsidy, you need long-term in order to make sure that those units continue to have decent quality moving forward. And so that is another area in which I think we just see some really difficult systemic dynamics going on.
Yeah, I'm curious what you see as some of the recent additional policy barriers that might compound some of these systemic issues and market failures. I mean, just this week we saw a bill introduced to, try to criminalize homelessness. There's the source of income discrimination legislation that passed, I believe last year. So how are some of these new pieces of legislation impacting these longstanding issues?
Well, should we talk about the elephant in the room? I mean, this is a political issue. And you have politicians that have no empathy for people who can't pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And that's the mentality we have in this country now. It's a mentality we've had for a long time. And we just have to get engaged. We have to get people engaged in this issue and as a political issue, and ask questions about how we are really helping our communities, and how do we protect all the citizens that live in a community, and how housing can be important to that. But when you have legislation where they're criminalizing homelessness, we have a pretty high hill to climb to educate these people, but it is important. And every housing project we've done, we've gone to the neighborhood, we've gone to the neighbors, we've talked to them. It is sometimes easier than we thought. Sometimes it's very difficult. We've been in a project with Clinton for 2 years. We've gone through all the hoops. We've got all the approvals. We have the city and the county, coming up with money to supply the gap financing. We've had businesses and neighbors support us. We've had Republican and Democratic candidates and legislators and supervisors and city council people, but we still have a handful of citizens that are suing the city because they don't want supportive housing near them. And so we have to understand that this is a political environment that we're in, and we have to stand up to it. And so educating our politicians is the most important thing we could do right now. And there is legislation that advocates can point to that will help promote and the education and the financing of these projects.
I'm going to tag on to what Jack said. It is absolutely partly about educating our legislatures, but if y'all's city and county governments work anything like ours, it's also really important to get to city and county staff, because they are the ones who are there year in, year out, election cycle to election cycle to election cycle. And it's really important to have them have a really, really good understanding of root issues and causes. And along those same lines, politicians listen to their voters. So we've had really good luck doing get out the vote campaigns and talking with our own clients. Once you've got an address, you can vote. And you can vote without an address too. But really making sure that the folks that we serve understand that they have a voice and how important it is for them to vote and the amount of weight that their vote carries.
It's really critical. And I think Elizabeth hit it right on the head. Your staff of your city and your county, we couldn't go anywhere. We could not put a shovel in the ground without them. And the stronger they are in understanding this issue, the better chances developers and advocates will have in building projects. And I noticed that on your list of panels, you've had several people, Jennifer and Sarah from Cedar Rapids, and people from United Way and county government, it's really important for them to speak up and to support you, because they provide the real information to their policymakers that sometimes we can't.
I might jump in here too and talk about, again, why we felt like the Alliance for Equitable Housing was such an important way forward through a lot of these conversations, because I think you're absolutely right. I think staff persons within city and county government makes a huge difference. And what we recognized, again, post-COVID, I don't know if I can say post-COVID yet. I really want to say post-COVID. Post-derecho, certainly, coming out of disaster response, we recognize the need to really do all of this together. And especially when we're talking about policy shifts and policy change, I think the more unified your voice is and the more unified your education is in these different areas, the more impactful it becomes. And so that's another really big reason why we felt like moving forward with the direction through the Alliance for Equitable Housing was such a critical piece for us to start to overcome some of these challenges that we have, regardless of what they are. But policy, certainly policy is one of those, a really big part of that. And again, the education and making sure that we are all advocating for the same thing. And if politicians are hearing it, they're hearing the same thing from a number of different folks.
Yeah, for people not from this area tuning in, could you perhaps speak a little more to kind of how the Alliance for Equitable Housing came together and what sort of the, as this work has started to, essentially create a paradigm shift in how we think about the issue, what some of the main takeaways have been so far and sort of where the coalition's headed?
Sure. So I will do my best to do this concisely, but tell me I need to cut it off. So the Alliance for Equitable Housing came out of disaster response, as I just said, through both the COVID-19 pandemic and the August 2020 derecho. There was a pretty critical realization within the community that housing continued to be, but it was exacerbated by those disaster responses, a huge issue that we had to grapple with. And it came actually as a call to action from our local COAD, the LAPAID, Lynn Area Partners Active in Disaster, to say that we need to take a really hard look and really focused look at housing to figure out how we overcome the challenges that we have and effectively recover from disaster. And so we brought together a group of key stakeholders within the housing community, both from local governments to nonprofits to local funders, to start to figure out exactly how we want to move forward. We went out and had a lot of community conversations to try to get a much better understanding about what the atmosphere was actually like. Because as we started talking and trying to figure it out, we also didn't really have a good understanding because so much was in flux and so much was changing at that time. Again, the derecho had a huge impact here in Lynn County. And the eviction moratorium also had a really substantial impact in trying to figure out what that was going to be, what the outcome of that was going to be in the local community. And ultimately, what we did was we landed on 4 key areas of issues within the community where we've also identified action planning groups that are trying to take really, tangible, looking at this issue and breaking it down into pieces and making tangible, actionable steps towards how we start to address those things. So the 4 key issue areas that we landed on were housing quality. That was a huge topic of conversation within the community and a huge priority for community as we move forward. We also had issues around access to housing and homelessness. We also had issues around housing development and housing scarcity. And then finally, but definitely not least, was issues around equity. And what, again, the loud and clear call to action from community was that unless you start to address all of this through an equity lens, looking at gender, race, ethnicity, age, disability, any number of things, you're not actually going to solve the problem unless you do that really effectively. And so that's been a really big piece of the Alliance for Equitable Housing as well, is trying to figure out how do we effectively and genuinely, I keep trying to really harp on that too, really genuinely put an equity lens on all of the work that we are doing and figure out how do we align ourselves in a more effective way to address these issues. I would say one of the key learnings through this whole process is that you have to be patient. These things do take a really long time to start to figure out exactly how you can move forward and what are the most pragmatic steps you can be taking. But then also just how critical it has been to do all of this together. We've been really fortunate that through disaster response, community members involved in the Alliance for Equitable Housing are 100% willing to do things different if it means achieving some of our ultimate goals. And that's where you need to get to, but it's still hard. It's still a really hard hill to climb to address these really big issues. So anyone, please feel free to ask follow-up questions to that, but I think I'll probably pause there because I could go on for probably another hour.
Thank you. Let's see, we do have another audience question, which just a reminder to everyone watching, you're free to share those at any time and I'll incorporate those into our discussion. But this question asks, it seems that many people think that housing for homeless is important, but someone else should solve it, not realizing that they must be a part of the solution. Is there a day on the Hill for homelessness discussions? Perhaps, I don't know, maybe something that might be relevant to this, Jessica. I know you talked about sort of the like affordable housing bus tours that happen in Johnson County. So could start there.
Yeah, and I was going to refer to former Senator Jack over here about organizing a day on the Hill, but I know the Iowa Housing Partnerships has also, Dan Garrett over there has been organizing different days, and I specifically have not participated in one about homelessness, but I was there last Tuesday, if time is even a thing, looking at a calendar, about manufactured housing and those residents' rights. So there's a lot of different proposed bills on the table, whether in subcommittee or actually getting through funnel week related to housing. Jack, do you know specifically if there was one related to persons experiencing homelessness?
No, but there are multiple days on the hills for low-income individuals, and housing has always been a part of that, sponsored by a variety of groups, but I'm not aware of any of them right now.
Yeah, and whoever had made that comment, they are more than welcome to send me an email, whether you are in Johnson County or not, and we can get that coordinated as well, either this year, next year. I mean, as we talked about the elephant in the room, it's going to be an overarching battle that we're going to have for at least a couple of years, protecting those that we love and serve, and so we can organize it together. I'm all up for collaborations. But what Marissa had talked about was kind of an eye-opening experience that we participate in over here in Johnson County, are affordable housing bus tours. So the coalition has partnered with the Housing Trust Fund of Johnson County, and we are actually planning our second bus tour for our local elected officials, key stakeholders, and other policymakers to demonstrate where their money is going for these housing developments, whether it's LIHTC or locally funded as well, that do support not only individuals that are formerly homeless, but other needed housing sources that we have here in Johnson County. So I'm planning another one. They take a little bit of time and effort, but again, that time and effort is worth it.
We have a comment that says, on the national level, the National Alliance to End Homelessness has an annual event in DC in July that includes a Capitol Hill Day. The website is at endhomelessness.org. And the Iowa Homeless Coalition has a day on the Hill next week on February 21st from 10 to noon. That information is available on iaboscoc.org. Yeah, so it sounds like there are definitely some dedicated advocacy days for this very thing. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm curious, how have you all been able to kind of work through some of these hurdles at the local level to, begin to change hearts and minds, with local policymakers, whether that's on the nonprofit side, development, Ashley, in local government world? How can we affect change?
There's nothing like a controversy that highlights an issue, and the one that comes up regularly when you're dealing with homeless housing is, of course, NIMBY, not in my backyard syndrome. And whether or not you're talking about Des Moines or a small city anywhere in Iowa, you will have neighbors that will oppose you. And it is important to get to your city council people. But as Elizabeth said earlier, staff is really important to be able to keep them in balance, because it doesn't take too many people to make too many phone calls to get a city council person to waver on their support for affordable housing. And that's why I've always said being on the city council is is one of the toughest jobs in elected politics. They are closest to the people, and they listen to everything from potholes to housing, to economic development, and they are aware of what's going on, but they need support. So the best thing to do is to identify a housing project that's being prepared and developed, and go and support them and reach out to the neighbors and highlight that project to your elected officials. And you talked about bus rides and tours. Every housing trust fund agency that is out there has these bus tours, and they are incredible. They really open the eyes of your elected officials and of your community. We had a project in 6th Avenue and University in Des Moines where we reached out to the neighborhood. And Des Moines has very organized neighborhoods. I mean, they have every inch of Des Moines is organized by a nonprofit or a neighborhood. And so we met with the executive committee, invited them to the location. And interestingly, one of the board members said, "Why do you want to bring foster kids into the toughest neighborhood that has the most crime? Aren't you concerned about their safety?" And I looked at John Royal was his name, and I said, "John, that's the first time anybody's concerned about our residents. They're mostly concerned about your neighbors." And so you really get people to have a dialogue. And when you have a dialogue, you really have an understanding. And then you have a relationship that's built. So this outreach to your elected officials are so important to get them to understand the relationship between a community health, a family health, a neighborhood health, and how that environment really reaches to the individuals, the tenants that we're trying to help. We talk about politicians as if they're detached. We need to be talking about the tenants.
Mhm.
It's almost
Jack-
like you knew that Councilmember Dale Todd has joined the call.
I think Jack is absolutely right. And at the local level, I remember doing some policy advocacy work a number of years ago, and what one of my local officials said is 6 phone calls was enough to get a city or a county council person completely swayed on an issue. It's not that many people. So I think the other piece to educating our elected officials is also educating their constituents. For folks, humans are just naturally wary of things that they don't understand and people who feel different from them. So myth busting, storytelling, educating, again, not only elected officials, but their constituents, are the neighbors of the folks that we're looking to serve. Here at Charlotte Family Housing, we take every opportunity that we can to do this myth busting and get in front of lay people, service clubs, our faith partners, Sunday school groups, service clubs, book clubs, anybody that we can use as our own community advocates. We find that to be really, really successful.
I like to advocate to push local ordinances a little bit on their, boundaries as well. A lot of times we hear that we can't do this. That's a rule here. That's a rule there. And it's not really a rule. It's not really a law. It's something that has just been that way. Right. And so it is difficult to push boundaries and to look into things that we don't know. As Elizabeth was saying, it can be kind of scary. But, coming up with new local ordinances do have that, I'm not going to call it trickle down, but a trickle up effect, of our local larger state representatives. And so pushing those local ordinances is something I think Iowa City is well known for. And we're okay with that. We are very proud of that. And we're going to keep trying to do that if that is in the best interest of our residents.
And what would you say are some of those local ordinances in Johnson County that could be beneficial if they do have that trickle up effect.
Yeah. Well, the number one that I love and we'll say later is my favorite policy that should be implemented at the state level is that source of income discrimination, the anti-discrimination law. We have a local ordinance, so did Des Moines, so did Marion, that stated landlords could not reject housing choice or Section 8 voucher holders on how they paid their rent. Landlords could still do all their regular qualifications, credit score, criminal history, what have you. But they couldn't discriminate against a tenant simply because they were paying with a HUD voucher. As you guys had alluded to earlier, it did get struck down by the governor. The governor signed SF 252 back in 2021, and then it just got actually enacted for those cities that had ordinances in this last year of 2023. So I can also put in some, more citations, PhD hat over here, more citations into the chat for y'all about who is that actually hurting and why is it actually, why it should be for the state. That's probably my favorite local ordinance. And then the other one is we have a district here that requires 10% affordable housing in all new builds that are in this area, or developers can pay a fee to get out of having affordable units actually on site so we can build them elsewhere.
Ashley, what about Lynn County? So we actually talked about this a little in yesterday's panel, but I think it's worth reiterating here. Just some of the exploration of, a risk pool to incentivize developers to, expand who is in their housing.
Sure. Are you just wanting to know like what we're sort of looking into or what led to that, or?
What the possible like landlord risk pool would entail, and
Sure. So one of the reasons why we started going down this path for a few reasons. One is because we are recognizing that we need to do a better job of relationship building and working more closely with our local landscape of private landlords. Again, I sort of alluded to this a little bit, but when we were talking about like the eviction moratorium and all of those things in place, I think there was a lot of detrimental things done like within our landlord population, right? I know like when prices were really high, they sold, and sometimes to bigger companies that maybe not necessarily as willing to work with populations as some of those smaller private landlords. I also just feel like in general, there has just been more, I don't know, negative feelings, I think, is sort of like within that landlord tenant relationship. And we would like to try to figure out ways to rebuild that, right? Or build new if it never existed in the past, because the reality is that it is seen so much as this very adversarial relationship when I don't believe it needs to be. But I think both landlords can come at this with a negative connotation of their tenants, and then vice versa. I think tenants can often feel just a lot of fear of their landlord and not being willing to talk to them or work with them. And instead, I think they just sometimes leave. So the reason why we started to bring this incentive package together, and again, it's still very much in its development phase, is that sort of a two-pronged approach, one where we're trying to incentivize landlords to take on some of those harder to house populations with a risk mitigation pool, because so much is the idea that tenants are going to get in and they're just going to destroy the unit, right? So they don't want to take on these hard to house tenants. But what we learned from other communities is that's very rarely the case. Occasionally it is, but very rarely does that actually happen. And these risk pools don't actually need to be very much money because they're so infrequently used, right? The other piece of the package that we're looking at adding, though, is a tenant incentive portion of this to try to help really foster that relationship and encourage tenants to consistently reach out to their landlords, especially if they're encountering issues, and help leverage some of the third parties that we have within our nonprofit sector in particular to help with those conversations, because it's not always true that they go well. But I think it's really important to make sure that we are continuing to foster that, both from the landlord perspective and make sure that they have a support system behind them when issues are encountered, but then also the tenants, right? So that's one of the big reasons why we're trying this is, one, to help broaden the amount of landlords in our community that are willing to rent to some of those harder to house populations, but then also start to figure out how do we build those relationships in a more meaningful way moving forward.
Actually, I'm loving all of that. We're doing some similar things here in the Iowa City area of the Landlord Risk Mitigation Fund and kind of breaking those myths and barriers to getting hard to house individuals into these homes. And we're trying to work with landlords, right? That's a lot of it is sometimes people think we're only for the tenants. It's like, no, we're for housing, and that's for anybody that works within housing, correct? And so I'm loving what you guys are doing. I think that it's just great. Another thing would be, you know, having like, we have expungement clinics that are going to be happening too. We have quarterly expungement clinics that are put on. They're funded through the city of Iowa City, given through a grant to Shelter House, again, one of our partners. And they would then be able to remove items that are on criminal backgrounds that just don't need to be there. Such as if you had an FED or an eviction filed in the state, you could look it up at fingertip access at iowacourts.gov. That doesn't need to be there, you know, and so it would be able to wash away some of those just easily tangible things that might prevent individuals or bar them from getting housing to start. And sometimes it just takes that. Sometimes it just takes one little change or one little myth busting to get landlords to accept individuals, and then they can be great tenants, absolutely wonderful tenants that stay years and have that positive relationship you're talking about with their landlord.
I love what I'm hearing about making sure that the landlords are at the table and part of crafting the solutions. I think it's also really important that we recognize, I think on the human services side, we've always just lumped landlords into one big category without recognizing that it is a very diverse business pool, and Jack can certainly speak to this, but when you think of like corporate multifamily with mortgages and, you know, lenders and investors who need a specific rate of return, individual owners with small portfolios, or management companies who manage for a multitude of different owners. All of them have different business needs and different business drivers. And I think it's really important to, number one, recognize that, and number two, help craft solutions and tools to participation that work for all of those different business types.
Right. And when you're crafting those arguments, right, it's going to be a different argument that you spin on it, right? Most of the time, I'll say this, you can't change a lot of hearts sometimes in the corporate world, but you can change how they think by making that economic connection. You know, during the pandemic, landlords that were accepting housing choice vouchers had the most stable amount of revenue out of anybody around. And so when I hear people say they don't want to accept housing choice voucher, it's just absurd when that is the most stable rent that they got during that time. So you're talking to the person that took economics for policy analysis as an elective in public health. So economics definitely can drive different forces.
I mean, Jack, from your perspective as a developer and former state lawmaker, I mean, what sort of policies might get developers to subscribe to, you know, supporting these higher need clients?
Sure. We, I submitted to the Gazette a list of priorities that the Iowa Housing Partnership Association has been pursuing. And there's some very significant policy questions that they pose. And in Iowa, they are in large cities and in counties, and the state has it for the balance of the state, that for those counties that don't have it. And that provides direct assistance to housing advocates and developers, specifically for the area that they're calling. Some are giving supportive services, some are putting their money into rent assistance, some are helping developers finance the actual financing of a project. And so the policy question there is that the state should put in more money, because this is money that's being spent quickly and efficiently and effectively to a wide variety of constituents. And this is probably one of the best areas of financing for homeless.
Yeah, and for the rest of you, I mean, if you could enact a policy, you know, at the state, federal level, or from what we're seeing in our communities, is there a solution that you think would be effective if scaled, you know, across the state?
For me, I think The biggest thing is thinking about eviction prevention and eviction prevention services and support that prevent financial emergencies rather than respond to emergencies. Thinking about things like childcare vouchers that support people maintaining stable housing, and expanding our thoughts around some of these supports, how supports in other areas support folks maintaining stable housing. Studies have shown that for every dollar spent on prevention and housing stability prevents us from spending $4 in homeless support. So I think helping our elected officials understand how cost-effective their dollars can be in expanding their thinking about what eviction prevention means.
Again, I'll go back to source of income discrimination. Locally, we had a homeless encampment fire right before the holidays, and over a dozen individuals were affected, and all of those individuals actually are housing choice voucher holders that cannot find housing in our community, so they're choosing to live outside at that point. The other thing would be, the House bill that's put up right now, which is for local control a little bit more, which is 2221. So House Filing 2221 is a bill that's looking at enacting potential rent limitations on private properties, or just capping that increase, specifically if that could relate to manufactured housing. I think that would be a huge deal for 562B as well.
I think I would agree with Elizabeth. And I think looking at really some of those housing stabilization efforts that look more preventative and more root cause for why we have some of these housing challenges that we have, specifically within individual families, like what is leading to their lack of or their inability to afford housing, what supports can we wrap around them to help them along the way. That feels like really, really important for a lot of these conversations that we're having about housing. But then, of course, I think funding for housing, right? And some of these really deep subsidies that we know we critically need for some of the populations that we're serving. Funding and massive funding feels like a really, really important thing too.
And I'm going to say more funding for our nonprofits, right? The ones that are doing the actual groundwork, and most of them do have capacity to, have their own housing, develop their own housing. We need our for-profits for sure. But we have a lot of really amazing nonprofits that provide housing, and then that money stays within our local communities and will be reinvested into housing here where it came from. So not overlooking our nonprofits and their capacities to be able to do so, I think, is also a key factor on that funding stream.
Yeah, one other way to increase capacity is a partnership between the developer and nonprofits and the programs that the state already has. So in our foster care projects in Des Moines and Cedar Rapids, there's a scholarship program that any foster care kid who's not adopted by age of 16 gets their education paid for as a scholarship. And then you add that to housing that through a developer uses, if the state incentivizes them to create those partnerships with the nonprofits, then you really have a strong housing project that satisfies the tenants or the tenant's responsibility and needs by using existing money that's already there. So we could capitalize more if we partner with existing programs. Some of them are educational, some of them nonprofit, some of them are private, especially training programs that the state employs. So the housing developer, the role of the housing developer, private or nonprofit, should really reach out, and they could reach out if the state agencies encourage them by incentivizing them to do this in a real sense.
Yeah, just to also jump on what Jessica and Jack said, because I completely agree with that as well. And also, I think maybe further clarifying what I said when it comes to funding, I mean funding from like the federal government, really substantial, meaningful amounts of funding. And then associated with that, I think, is cutting through a lot of the bureaucracy and red tape that is associated with those funding resources that can sometimes make them really not cost effective, right? Like the amount of staff time and capacity that you need to administer from those funding sources. Like if there was a way for us to cut through some of that, I think that would be hugely beneficial to a lot of our partners that try to do this work on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, well, I know we are just about at time here, so we'll begin to sign off. Thank you again to our panelists for being part of this discussion, to our audience for following along, and to our sponsor, ITC Midwest. All sessions from the week will be available for replay at www.ioideas.com, and please save the date for the full conference on October 10th and 11th. Thank you all for joining us.